A few days ago, me and my friends sat down to play D&D, but 3 of my 6 players were unable to make it. So instead of playing the campaign without them and having them miss out on what happened, or worse than that, not playing D&D at all and canceling the session, I decided to improv a one-shot with the players who were there. My name is Zach Dyson, this is Dungeon Master Design, and today I'll be teaching you how to improv a session of Dungeons & Dragons.
My son, he's gone missing.
Oh, I don't trust that guy.
I just blast.
Like how you would do a dagger, but it's a long sword?
You must not go through the portal to the great beyond!
We're here for the cult stuff?
And then you just see his face
Skeletal wings go.
just blast 2 holes straight through his chest.
You're Raymond, right?
I'm not tethered by the bonds of this material plane anymore.
Yes, my boy, your brain is very special.
He wraps his mouth tentacles around Raymond's head, slots the brain into a pedestal.
Eldrim's.
Take my rifle, and I slam the end of it into the ground so the metal rod hits the ground.
Perhaps I underestimated the 3 of you.
Eldritch blast!
And just hit him right in the face, and his head. Do you think my dad is still gonna, love me if I'm a boat?
Probably not.
Do you have news of my boy?
He is the boat.
Would you like to sail off into the sunset?
And then he turns around and gets on the ship. Maybe you didn't have time to prepare for a session, or your players took an unexpected turn that you weren't ready for. Maybe they went to a city that you hadn't yet fleshed out the details of. Whatever the reason, now you need to fly by the seat of your pants and you're making up the session off the top of your head. Like it or not, improv is just part of being a dungeon master, and sooner or later, you're going to come into a situation like this. The question is, what do you do when you get here? How do you improvise an entire session of D&D? Now, of course, there are tools and random tables and generators and all types of things that you can use to help you in situations like this, but I'm going to be working off the assumption that you don't have any of those things and you're working from an entirely blank slate. So, without anything prepared, no tools at your disposal, how do you proceed with a session of Dungeons & Dragons? Well, the short answer is you don't. At least not entirely. Now, before you click off the video and cancel your session, hear me out. You should never go into a session of Dungeons & Dragons with absolutely nothing prepared. You can always find at least a little bit of time to write something down. Now, if you're in the middle of a session and your players do something unexpected that you're not ready for, here's what you're going to do. Take 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, that's all you need, and you're going to use that time to prepare yourself to be able to improvise the rest of the session. Tell your players to go get something to drink or to talk amongst themselves for a moment, and while they do, here's what you're going to write down. An appropriate boss monster, an interesting location, and an actionable hook. With just those 3 things, you'll have everything you need to improvise an adventure. You have the basic skeleton of where your players are going to go and what they're going to do, and from there you can begin to improvise and add things in. So first, you'll need an appropriate boss monster. Now, there are plenty of plots and adventures in D&D that don't end in a boss monster fight, but we're not looking to be clever or sophisticated here. We're trying to wing it, so a boss monster will do just fine. This is Dungeons and Dragons, after all. Fighting monsters is the name of the game. My recommendation is you think of a boss monster off the top of your head, because the monsters that you can think of by yourself are the ones that you're going to be most familiar with. You'll know how their stats work, and you won't have to fumble around with their stat block. However, if you're not very familiar with the monster manual and you do need some help thinking of a monster, I recommend going to Kobold Fight Club. This is a website that can recommend monsters to you of an appropriate CR level, and it can get the juices flowing to see where you want to take your improv session. Another option is to just open the monster manual. Start flipping through pages until you find a monster of the right CR that looks interesting to you. Whatever it is, you want to pick a monster that's going to be satisfying as a climax to your adventure, that's going to be fun to kill and interesting to tell stories about after the fact. Next, you need to put that boss monster in an interesting location. You don't want this to just be the old woman's house down the street. It needs to be somewhere with a distinct title or a remarkable landscape. So think Old Dwarven Fortress or Castle on the Hill, something like that, something that will catch the player's attention, that will give an excellent backdrop to your boss monster encounter. In addition to that, it needs to be a place for the players to go and have an adventure. You don't want it to be the tavern where they're already sitting or the inn where they're staying the night. You want them to go somewhere and do something and have an adventure. Speaking of which, that brings us to our third and most important part of improvising a D&D session, the actionable plot hook. Now, plenty of plot hooks and story hooks in D&D are vague and evocative, to borrow Dale Kingsmill's term.
Say it with me now. Vague and evocative. There it is.
There's a dragon up in the hill who's rumored to have lots of gold. There's a bounty on the wall for a murderer who is yet to be identified. There are even story hooks that begin with a man stealing a woman's gold and running away right in front of the players. The problem with all of these hooks is that the players have the option to ignore them if they want to. This is great for a sandbox adventure where the players can choose what they want to do and go anywhere and do anything. But that's not great for an improv session, because if your players choose to ignore that plot hook, you'll find yourself right back at square one with nothing prepared. So instead, you're going to want an actionable plot hook, and that means your plot hook requires action from the players. Even if it's to actively say no, or to run away, or to choose not to engage, the players must take action with this plot hook. This will thrust them into the action and get them moving, which is your best friend when it comes to improvising D&D. Your natural inclination will be to stall and delay the players as long as possible. Fight that instinct. You want the players to be doing things and in the middle of the action as soon as possible. It may feel like you're burning through all of the material that you have sooner rather than later, but I promise you'll be able to come up with more things as you go. Just don't stall the players, because they're going to get bored and they're going to get disinterested, and that will kill the momentum of your improvised game. So what does an actionable plot hook look like? Well, it's something like a person coming up and specifically asking them for help, or an enemy running up and pointing a sword at the players and starting combat. Whatever it is, it forces the players to take action, and once they've begun the action, the momentum will kind of carry them to the next step, and they'll end up going on whatever adventure you've planned. Now, of course, the players can still choose to not go on this adventure. You don't want to railroad them and force them. If you really have to, come up with another plot hook, come up with another improvised adventure. Don't force the players to do something they don't want to do. But in my experience, if you put something in front of the players that is an obvious plot hook you want them to go on, most players are good sports. They'll play along, they're gonna go on the adventure, and everybody's gonna have a good time. So now you have an appropriate boss monster, an interesting location, and an actionable plot hook. These are all the things you need to start your adventure. And like I said, you only want to take 5 minutes or so to come up with these 3 things, and then after that you can come up with some things as you're playing, and that's really where the improv is going to come into play. You'll be adding things on the fly for the players to interact with, engage with, obstacles, enemies, traps, interesting pieces of evidence, whatever it may be. So to prove that you can come up with the skeleton in just 5 minutes, I'm going to do so now. I'm going to set myself a timer, and I'm going to come up with an actionable plot hook, an interesting location, and an appropriate boss monster. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but I've got my 5-minute timer. Here we go. Okay, so we want to start with an appropriate monster, right? So we have 5 minutes on the clock. Let's say our players are CR5. So let's come up with a CR5 appropriate boss monster. Let's see, CR5 monsters I can think of off the top of my head. Gladiators are CR5. I think Gorillons are CR5. They might be CR3. I think there's a Yeti that's CR5. Either the normal Yeti or the abominable Yeti is CR5. I did use one of those in a one-shot recently, so I don't want to do those. What else is CR5? CR5. Elementals are CR5. Actually, I know elementals are CR5 because I did a TPK on my party one time with a fire elemental. That'll be a story for another time. But actually, that might be good. Let's redeem the fire elemental. We'll make our fire elemental our CR5 monster. So fire elemental is our appropriate boss monster. Now we need an interesting location. Let's see. A fire elemental would be in a volcano. But I can't think of a reason to get the players to a volcano from a normal location like a tavern. Maybe they're in a temple, castle, fortress. I think I like temple. They're in it's a fire elemental. Let's say it's a fire temple. What kind of fire temple would that? I guess like a fire god. Are there any fire gods in D&D? I can't think of any, so I'm gonna make one up. We'll call him Feral, like fire and feral, I think I like feral. So the fire deity feral. So we have an interesting location, and what's gonna get the players there? Maybe there were priests in this fire temple, and they accidentally set the fire elemental loose as part of a ritual, and they had to run away. But how do the players get there? What's the hook? How do we get them there? Maybe there is a woman and her husband was one of the priests and he's stuck in the temple, or he didn't come out of the temple. So the woman comes to the players and says, my husband is stuck in this temple with the fire elemental. Can you help me? Why do the players care about that? Why are they going to say yes? What's the reward? What's going to get them there? Oh, well, that's not a reward. What if she is a priestess of the fire temple and her husband is still a priest who's stuck in there, but she is, it's an evil fire temple, and she curses the players and says, whatever fate befalls my husband, that fate will befall you. So if he burns to death, you're going to burn to death too. You better go save my husband. Okay, so we have a fire elemental, appropriate boss monster. We have a fire temple to the deity Feral, who is a feral fire deity who is apparently evil. And we have a plot hook. A witch comes and curses the players, and they have to save this priest. Otherwise, they will befall the same fate as him. So there is your three things. And we have, we still have a full minute left to add some obstacles on top of that, but we won't use that time now. So hopefully you see what I mean by you really only need 5 minutes to get that skeleton planned out. And then from there, you can begin to flesh out and improvise and add things to your adventure. But now you've at least gotten the players moving. You've gotten them going toward the action. And if you do it right, they probably won't even know that you're making it up on the fly. Now, on top of that, there are some additional tips that I can offer that may help you during the rest of the session. My first tip is exaggerate your NPCs. Now, when you're thinking of things on the fly and improvising, your natural tendency is going to be to act timidly or a little unsure of yourself. This is a very natural reaction, and it's nothing to be embarrassed about. You are literally thinking of things off the top of your head, so you might not be the most confident. But one thing I have found is that if you over-exaggerate your NPCs and act confident in the way the NPCs behave, it tends to mask over that uncertainty. Again, your plot isn't going to be very sophisticated since you're making this up off the top of your head, so having interesting and flamboyant and exaggerated NPCs can help add some flavor to that rather simple plot. For instance, it's one thing to have a witch come and put a curse on the players. That's sort of interesting, it's kind of cool, but it's an entirely different thing to have a witch come and say,
Fire and darkness fall on you. The curse on him is for you to be true.
Or whatever it may be, right? I'm improvising off the top of my head, so it's not going to be great. But having that voice, having that over-exaggeration is going to add just a little bit of fun and spice to your otherwise pretty basic plots. Another tip that I have is what I like to call the add stuff first, ask questions later method. Now, like I said, you've got your basic skeleton for your adventure, but if the players just go to a temple and fight a fire elemental, that's not going to be terribly interesting in the long run, and it may only give you an hour to an hour and a half of gameplay. So you're going to want to come up with some other things for the players to interact with. Like I said before, obstacles or enemies or interesting pieces of evidence and lore, but these are not things that you've prepared, right? You're coming up with them off the top of your head. And your natural tendency is going to be to think of a reason why it's there before you put something into the world. Do away with that tendency. Just go with your gut and throw something into your adventure. Maybe it's something as simple as a locked door, but you're not really sure what's on the other side. You just put a locked door in front of the players. Well, while they're unlocking the door and making their thieves' tools check, you get to ask yourself why. What's beyond this locked door? Why is this locked door here? Well, if it's in a fire temple, maybe it's the head priest's quarters, and in his quarters is a scroll all about the ritual that went wrong. Or maybe behind this locked door are the precious gems that people gave as offerings to this evil god. It doesn't have to be anything crazy clever, it just has to be a reason for there to be a locked door. So don't be afraid to add things that don't really make sense, and maybe you won't come up with an explanation for it. Your players might not even ask why it's there in the first place, but if they do, be willing to sort of yes and what they have to say. If they ask you, is this a scroll that explains where fire elementals come from? Well, it wasn't 10 seconds ago, but yeah, you better believe it is. Give me an intelligence check to see if you can decipher the runes. Whatever it may be, this is a joint endeavor between you and your players. You're going to want to work with them to create the narrative. So add something in, ask questions later. And finally, the last piece of advice that I have is just relax and have some fun. It may turn out to be a disaster, but I guarantee even if everything goes wrong, you and your players are still gonna have a great time. At the end of the day, improv is a muscle just like every other skill. The more you do it, the better you'll be at it. Now, you can use some of these tips and tricks to help you get started, but again, you'll just have to practice it and keep doing it in order to get better. Like I said at the beginning of the video, having to wing a session of D&D isn't a question of if, it's a question of when you're a dungeon master. So don't worry, just relax and have a good time, and if you really want to intentionally practice improving as a DM, here's what I recommend. The next time you're planning a session or mapping out a dungeon or prepping for the next adventure, give yourself one room. Leave that room entirely blank. Don't prep anything for that one room. This is going to be your improv practice room. When the players get to that room, that's when you want to start making something up for it. Now, since you've planned the rest of the adventure, this one room doesn't have to be significant, and if you can't think of anything, it can turn out to just be a blank room. But it might turn out to be the most interesting room in the dungeon you've planned. Who knows? That's your place to practice improv until you get more comfortable and more confident with improving more and more and more until eventually you'll be comfortable improving an entire session for your players and you guys are going to have a great time. Now, of course, all of these tips are not the only way to improv a session of D&D. These are just things that I have found that work for me. So I encourage you to experiment with different methods. Look at other dungeon masters, ask them how they do it, see what their methods are. Because like I've always said, DMing is not a specific set of do's and don'ts. It's this collective pool of experience. So this is my experience with improving sessions. Hopefully it's been helpful to you, but I want you to know that you can come up with your own methods. Comment down below, tell me your methods for improving D&D sessions. But until the next time, my name is Zach Dyson. This has been Dungeon Master Design. Thanks for watching.